growing weary of the road. I'm on my way back to you. I'm on my way back to you. I feel doubt crawling, won't you dim my fears? Your voice is far away, won't you make it clear? Send a whisper to my prayer, blow your wind through my hair. I'm on my way back to you. I'm on my way. Won't you see me through? I'm on my way back to you. Back to you. Send a sign that I'll decode. I'm growing weary of the road. I'm on my way back to you. I'm on my way back to you.
There was a time and a place where I didn't have a time or a place. It was all about the games that I played. When you'd ask me, I'd say always later and later. Do me a favor and go away. Every time in my life when people around me got to talking, they tried to start a competition. I didn't need another issue. Everything else was just fine. All I needed was to get mine. But I always felt it calling from the other side.
The other side, the other side. From the other side. From the other side. From the other side.
If seeing is believing, I don't know what I'm feeling, but I love it more than I did before. If this is what you need, and I'm right for your energy, then let's just hit the floor. Let's just dream some more. Oh, I can hear you. I can hear you. Oh, I can hear you. Hear you calling. Oh, I would keep myself so hidden from it all. Didn't know just who I was. Couldn't see beyond the wall.
ये तेरे और मेरे आगे कितनी है दीवारें, सारी कर दे दिल के तू हवाले। रास्ता है लंबा, सदा है तेरा पक्का, अंदर की पुकार ना रखना तू अधूरा। From the other side. From the other side. side.
Seeing is believing. I don't know what I'm feeling, but I love it more than I did before. If this is what you need, and I'm right for your energy, then let's just hit the floor. Let's just dream some more. Can you feel the changes? All the doubt is fading, no fear anymore.
Sometimes in life the dark appears, even when the sun's out shining so bright. You need a sign for the clouds to clear. Just take a moment and search for the
बारिश के
light.
बाद धूप है, अंधेरे के बाद सुबह, परवाने की चाह है, जलती रहे इस दिल की शमा.
क्यों है खफा तू मायूस सा क्यों है, उसे याद कर. Just close your eyes and let your heart say that name, then you'll know you're not alone.
उम्मीद पे ये जहां कायम है.
No, you're right. क्यों सोचता तो खुद को अकेला.
जाला
With folded hands we will rise, rise above, come one day. क्यों है खफा तू मायूस सा क्यों है, उसे याद कर. Just close your eyes and let your heart say that name when you know you're not alone.
उम्मीद पे जहाँ कायम है.
No, you're not alone. When you call his name with joy or in pain, he'll be by your side, your strength to survive. जब तू मेरा है क्या करेगा ये अंधेरा.
Magami sayajali bhi walayat kayali. Amin magami sayajali bhi walayat kayali. उम्मीद पे जहाँ कायम है.
No, you're
उम्मीद पे जहाँ कायम है.
At a moment like this, I find myself thinking back to the days when we first launched the nation. That was more than half a century ago. It's hard to believe sometimes that it has been that long. And frankly, it is even harder to believe that so much time has passed since my childhood days here in Kenya and my continuing early visits to this country. When I think back to the founding of the nation, and when I reflect on how much has changed and how far we have come, I think especially about the hopes and the dreams with which we launched this company. Our goal then was to create a news medium that belonged to the whole of the nation of Kenya. And that, of course, is why we chose our company name. That dream moved ahead in a big way when we took the company to the public shareholding market, so that today a majority of the nation's shares are owned by the general public of Kenya. Our additional central goal at the time of our founding was to create a news medium that would be truly independent, a place where the public could find a voice it could trust, an objective and thoughtful voice, a voice that would tell people what the facts are as reliably as possible. Our goal was not to tell people what to think, but to give them reliable information so that they could think more clearly for themselves. All over the world, the number of media voices is exploding. Websites, bloggers, and social media voices multiply every day. The result is often a wild mix of messages: good information, bad information, superficial impressions, fleeting images, and a good deal of confusion and conflict. And this is true all over the world. On top of that, this is also a time when public emotions and political sentiments are intensifying and even polarizing, again, all over the world. The result, some people say, is that we live in a post-fact society. Yes, a post-fact society. It's not just that everyone feels entitled to his or her own opinion. That's a good thing. But the problem comes when people feel that they are entitled to their own facts. What is true, too often, can then depend not on what actually happened, but on whose side you are. Our search for the truth can then become less important than our allegiance to a cause, an ideology, for example, or a political party, or a tribal or religious identity, or a pro-government or opposition outlook. And so, publics all over the world can begin to fragment, and societies can drift into deadlock. In such a world, it is absolutely critical more than ever that the public should have somewhere to turn for reliable, balanced, objective, and accurate information as best as it can be discovered. No one, including the Nation Media Group, will ever be able to do that perfectly, but it is critically important that all of us should try.
یا علی مدد به همه و خوش آمدید به نسخه این هفته بازتاب از جمعه شبها. این یک افتخار بزرگ است که امشب در جمعه شبها هستم. من ناهید ننشی شهردار کلگری هستم. من به تازگی دهمین سال به عنوان شهردار را جشن گرفتم. اما خیلی مهمتر از آن این دومین حضور من در بازتاب جمعه شبها می باشد. بله، یک کمی غافلگیر شدم که دوباره مرا دعوت کردند. ولی حالا خوشحالم که در جمع شما هستم. من از استودیوی کاملا مجهز خود اینجا در کلگری با شما وصل هستم. از سرزمین پیمان 7 قوم، نتسی تاپی، مردمی که ما آنها را اکنون مردم کنفدریشن یا بلک فوت می نامیم و همچنین مردم کوهستان یا نکودا، مردم سنگی، مردم بیش از حد شجاع که ما آن را مردم سوتینا می نامیم، مردم متیس که ما آنها را به خاطر ارتباط عمیقشان با این سرزمین احترام میگذاریم. بنابراین من اینجا در استودیوی خانه کاملا مجهز خود که به آن اتاق غذاخوری نیز گفته می شود هستم. زیرا مطمئناً هیچ خانواده اسماعیلی در نسل من واقعاً در اتاق غذاخوری غذا نمیخورد. بنابراین من همچنین ممکن است از آن برای چیز استفاده کنم و تا زمانی که من آن گلدان را خراب نکنم فکر میکنم میتوانم به کار خود ادامه بدهم. چای و ناشتای خود را بگیرید، و بیایید در مورد بازتاب‌های این هفته صحبت کنیم. قبل از این که به موضوع این هفته بپردازیم، من می خواهم کمی در مورد ویروس های کرونا و در مورد اپیدمی کووید 19 صحبت کنم. 9 ماه میگذرد که ما این زندگی کاملا متفاوت را داریم. برای بسیاری از ما زمان انزوا و تنهایی زمان ترس بوده است. برای من و برخی از ما، از جمله من و خانواده هم، میدانم که بازگشایی جماعتخانه ها برای آن زمان هایی که قادر به گذراندن آن بودیم نعمت چشمگیری بود. اما در نهایت ما زندگی کاملا متفاوتی داریم و ممکن است که از این بابت احساس بدی داشته باشید. عزاداری برای چیزهایی که از دست داده ایم اشکالی ندارد. ناراحت بودن اشکال ندارد. این فقط احساس انسانی است. اما همچنین باید به یاد داشته باشیم این است که ما کارهای بیشتری برای انجام کار مشترک داریم. ما هنوز آنجا نیستیم و حتی در حالی که اعلامیه اخیر مبنی بر نزدیک بودن واکسین به معنای آن است که می توان آن طرف رودخانه را از روی پل مشاهده کنیم. اما باید روی پل بمانیم. اگر در آب بیفتیم این فایده ندارد. بنابراین من میدانم که مردم در سراسر کانادا با سیاست‌های مختلف دولت و محدودیت‌های مختلف روبرو هستند. اما لازم است که برای همه ما چیزی بگویم. این است که وقت نوع دیگری از بلایای طبیعی داریم و دچار سیل یا آتش سوزی می شویم، کاری از دست ما بر نمی آید. هیچ یک از ما نمی تواند باران یا آتش را کنترل کند، اما در همگیری شیوع همگیری در دست خود ماست. این در دستان پاک ماست. بنابراین لازم است به همه یادآوری کنم که نظم و دیسیپلین بهترین واکسین است و ما باید نظم و انضباط خود را ادامه دهیم. این بدان معنی است که دستهای خود را بشویید، سرفه های خود را بپوشانید تا از بهداشت مناسب برخوردار باشید. این بدان معنا است که فاصله جسمی خود را 6 فیت یا 2 متر حفظ کنید. هر زمان در جمع هستید، هر زمان که قرار است در این فاصله 2 متری دیگران باشید، از ماسک استفاده کنید. و من قصد دارم 2 چیز دیگر اضافه کنم. مورد بعدی تزریق واکسن انفلوانزا است. انفلوانزا هیچ ارتباطی با کووید 19 ندارد. اما اگر واکسن انفلوانزا بگیرید، به این معناست که احتمال ابتلا به انفلوانزا کمتر می شود و در مزدحمترین فصل سال نیز به مراقبت پزشکی نداشته و غلبه بر سیستم بهداشتی دارید. و دیگر این که وقت آن است که از این لاک خود را بیرون کنیم. وقت آن است که در مورد تک تک تصمیماتی که میگیرید خوب فکر کنید. آیا این کار درسته برای انجام دادن است؟ آیا حالا باید این کار را انجام دهم؟ در اینجا در آلبرتا نخست وزیر بسیار واضح گفته است اگر آن شخص در خانه شما زندگی نکند نباید در خانه شما باشد. ما باید گروه خود را کوچک نگه داریم. ما باید اطمینان حاصل کنیم که همه کارها را برای جلوگیری از رفتارهای پرخطر انجام می‌دهیم تا کسانی که باید به محل کار خود بروند، کسانی که خدمات ضروری ارائه می‌دهند که نمی‌توانند از خانه کار کنند، توانایی انجام چنین کاری را داشته باشند. ما باید بتوانیم سخت کار کنیم تا در مناطقی که مکاتب باز است بتوانیم آن را برای دانش آموزان خود باز نگه داریم. بنابراین برای بسیاری از ماها من همین حرف را میزنم و میخواهم دوباره آن را بگویم. این در مورد دست تمیز است. این در مورد بهداشت خوب، اما واضح‌تر در مورد فکر کردن در مورد تک تک تصمیماتی است که با لنز کووید میگیریم. و این در مورد قلب باز، مهربانی و مهرورزی و هر روز مراقبت از یکی دیگر است. زیرا ما از این طریق همه چیز اینجا با هم در این سرزمین داریم. پس یک جا و با هم این مسئله و مشکلات را مدیریت خواهیم کرد و از پس آن برخواهیم آمد. من از موضوع امشب بسیار هیجان زده هستم. موضوع امشب واقعیت و داستان و نقش رسانه‌ها در دموکراسی است. اکنون یکی از دلایلی که من از این موضوع هیجان زده شده ام این است که می توانم هیئت از روزنامه‌نگاران و همچنین زین را به صحبت وادارم. ما به این موضوع رسیدگی خواهیم کرد. من معمولا در انتهای دیگر این سوالات هستم. معمولا سوال سخت از من می شود. بنابراین بیایید ببینیم که برعکس چگونه کار میکنم. این یک مسئله واقعا مهم برای همه ما است که اکنون باید در جوامع خود به آن فکر کنیم. مطمئنا بسیاری از ما به خاطر انتخابات ایالات متحده به صفحه تلویزیون چسبیده هستیم. آیا از آریزونا خبری هست یا تا به حال نه؟ آیا اخبار کجا قرار است برود؟ بعد از انتخابات چه اتفاقی میافتد؟ چه اتفاقی میافتد اگر کسی قبول نکند؟ اما چیزی بسیار عمیق‌تر از آن در رابطه با مکالمه و دیالوگ است که ما آن را به عنوان یک اجتماع با هم داریم. چطور شد که نهادهای رسانه‌ای که گرد هم آمده اند تا داستانهای ما را بازگو کنند و به ما کمک کنند تا به عنوان یک جامعه پیش برویم، اکنون به عنوان این که اخبار جعلی در خور مردم میدهند مورد تمسخر قرار گیرند. مردم به آنها اعتماد ندارند. مردم به شبکه‌های اجتماعی مراجعه میکنند. مردم برای تعیین نظرات خود در دنیای پست واقعیت یا پست فکت زندگی میکنند. و چگونه این اتفاق میافتد و نقش جامعه ما در اطمینان از تقویت دموکراسی ما چیست؟ نقش رسانه‌ها در اطمینان از تقویت دموکراسی چیست؟ بنابراین مرحله اصلی امروز ما یک پنل باور نکردنی است و من میدانم که شما مانند من احساس غرور میکنید وقتی میبینیم افراد مانند مهمانان بعدی خود در تلویزیون در مورد مسائل مهم صحبت میکنند. وقتی میبینیم افرادی که شبیه ما هستند و از جامعه اسماعیلی هستند و از ما نمایندگی میکنند باعث میشود همه احساس غرور کنیم. و من بسیار افتخار میکنم که امروز گرد هم آمده ایم و آن هم با 2 تن از مشهورترین روزنامه‌نگاران در آمریکای شمالی و همچنین زین. بنابراین امشب ما از علی ولشی میشنویم. میدانید علی ولشی کانادایی ساکن شهر نیویورک است؟ وی در CNN کار کرده است. او نمایش خود را در الجزیره آمریکا داشت. وی به عنوان خبرنگار تجارت آغاز به کار کرد و البته از سال 2016 وی یکی از مجریان اصلی MSNBC بوده است. و اخیراً تعداد زیادی از شما او را دیده اید. او چند داستان آزاردهنده در مورد معنای روزنامه نگاری در زمان اخبار جعلی دارد. ما فر ناصر را نیز با خود داریم. برای کسانی که در تورنتو هستید میدانید که او یکی از معتبرترین صداهای اخبار محلی است. در تورنتو مجری اخبار گلوبال نیوز در ساعت 5:30 و 6 عصر است. او انتخابات را در هر سطح پوشش داده است. وی تنها بحث شهرداری در انتخابات شهردار تورنتو را تحت پوشش داشت. در 2018 او جریان حمله با موتر وان در تورنتو، نشست G20، دادگاه‌های ترور هدفمند 18 تورنتو را پوشش خبری داد. او پشت سر هم برنده جایزه RTDNA یا سام راس اوارد است. و گزارش وی به ویژه در مورد تنوع، شمولیت و نژاد پرستی فوق‌العاده در خور توجه است. بنابراین من از داشتن علی و فرح امروز در کنار ما بسیار خوشحال هستم. ما امروز نیز به طور غیر قابل مترقبه زین ولجی را داریم. ما نمیدانیم چرا او اینجا است. او قبلا میزبان باستاب جمعه شبها بوده است. او روزنامه‌نگار نیست. اما شما همه او را در تلویزیون میبینید. با تمام جدیت زین یک رهبر فوق‌العاده جامعه در اینجا در کلگری است. من افتخار میکنم که او را دوست بسیار خوب مینامم. دوستی ما بدیهی است که کاملا مبتنی بر شوخی‌های بد با یکی دیگر است. وی یکی از اعضای 40 برتر زیر 40 سال بوده است. از نظر حرفه‌ای او یک شرکت استراتژیک و بازاریابی به نام نورث ویدر است که کارهای خارق العاده را برای امور خیریه، غیر انتفاعی اهداف و وکالت انجام می دهد. و اگر طرفدار پادکست باشید میدانید که زین میزبان یکی از بالاترین امتیازات پادکست در کانادا است، The Strategists، و همچنین سپین آف، آنجایی که کانادایی ها می خواهند با آمریکایی ها در مورد زندگی خود صحبت کنند و همین امسال به وی جایزه فارغ التحصیلان دانشگاه آلبرتا اهدا شد. بنابراین با این کار بیایید به پنل برویم.
So thank you so much for joining us today. Two of North America's most prominent journalists in local, national, and international news, and also Zane, who I understand owns a television. So I don't want this whole conversation to be about the United States election, but anyone who was watching television on election night and flipping between channels would have seen all three of you. And I thought that it might be fun to start with a little anecdote from there. And plus, I've got Ali Velshi here, so I have to ask him the question that everyone in North America wants the answer to. So we're going to start there, Ali. Did your colleague, Steve Kornacki, ever get to sleep?
I made 4 attempts over 5 days to get him to leave. I was marginally successful a couple of times. I got him to leave. He didn't seem convinced that he was leaving. I think I stayed on TV for 2 or 2.5 hours, and he just came back, and he looked exactly the same. As you know, he wore the same clothes for several days. He's just retired his tie now, and it's all ripped up and damaged. But he slept, I think, 4 hours or 5 hours over 5 days.
Wow. And I thought the rest of us were staying up late. Why don't I go to each of you, and we'll start with you, Ali. Just give us your favorite anecdote from that long, long election night, and tell us a good story. Go ahead, Ali.
You're kidding me, right? There are no favorite anecdotes. This is an extension of a long nightmare for us. I started, one thing I did, I relieve when I can Steve Kornacki at the big board. There are only a few of us who have trained on it, but I actually wanted to be out there. I've spent most of the last few months in different places in America, mostly in swing states, and I ended it up in Philadelphia. And we planned this months ago. Where would I finally be? Where would I be on the last weekend of the election? Where would I be on election night? And I was in the streets of Philadelphia. And whatever ends up happening with this, and however it goes, and there are lots of issues to discuss about misinformation and the anger, the visceral anger in America. 150 million people almost voted. At least you're starting with the idea that people had enough civic responsibility to go to the ballots and vote. Whether they were doing it on bad information is a secondary issue, and we need to deal with that. But being in Philadelphia and watching the record-setting voting through the course of the day, for a lot of people who told me it was their first election, and they were much older than voting age, they were out there, they felt they had a role in the future of America, and regardless of the outcome of the election, it was great to actually see that level of participation. Typically in America, we see about 55%. We probably hit about 65% this time.
It's amazing. Fire, what about you? Covering it in a very different way from a Canadian perspective. What was your favorite part of the night or your most interesting anecdote?
Yeah, I mean, unlike Ali, this is my first U.S. election covering it from Washington, D.C. So it was unforgettable. It was incredible. But I think the thing that I'm going to remember the most is actually not election night. It is Saturday morning when the result was called. And it's because I got to DC about a week earlier, and it was so sleepy, and you could just really feel the anxiety, and people were just anxious. There was this uncertainty, and then it's like the entire capital of the United States changed in an hour. It was like a different place. There was so much energy. There was really this feeling like everybody was just kind of breathing this like sigh of relief and just exhaling for the first time in a long time. And people were popping champagne. They were dancing in the streets. They were singing. And just seeing that shift is something I'm never going to forget. It was unbelievable.
Amazing. Now, I was busy in a city council meeting all evening, and so I was relying on massively refreshing your websites and occasional texts from Zane, who was busy doing commentary that night as well. And when I finally got home, I heard Zane say one of the most thoughtful things I've heard any commentator say that evening about the nature of the referendum that we were witnessing. So Zane, tell us your favorite anecdote and give us the line about the referendum.
Well, thank you, Nahid. And I just want to clarify for Jamaati members listening at home, I have two TVs, not just one TV. So I'm doing okay. And in fact, one of those TVs is even a color TV. Okay, so here, let me, for the election night for me, it was this moment where I kind of realized that this was not just an election where folks were having a referendum on Donald Trump. They were having a referendum on each other. Because, the first time they elected Donald Trump, you wanted to shake up the system, you wanted a different sort of voltage in Washington, that's fine. But for the second time, you've got 6 years of a track record and 4 years of a presidency to know exactly who this guy is, to know, exactly what he stands for, how he conducts himself, how he thinks about big and small issues, how he thinks about other people. So I think that's going to be the real reconciliation point that's going to extend well beyond the Joe Biden presidency, perhaps, which is, to that point now, that referendum on each other that this election was also about.
And that's really where I want to take a little jump, if I may. We've got with us some incredibly accomplished people, and I know as an Ismaili community, we're also very proud of you, and we feel a little bit of pride when we see you on the air telling these important stories. But we live in a strange media world. So I just celebrated my 10th anniversary as the mayor of Calgary, believe it or not. And when I started in the first year, I had a full press gallery. They sit in windows, in little offices with windows that overlook the council chamber. As of this election, the entire City Hall press gallery in Canada's third largest city was down to 3 full-time reporters, all of whom had to cover other things from time to time. We're up to 4 now. Thank you, Global. We've added a City Hall reporter. But we've gone from 10 or 12 or 15 people who covered City Hall every single day to 3 people. And they're great reporters, but their job is just stenographer. All they can do is say, and council voted on this and council voted on that. They don't have the time or the ability to get deep into the stories. So I'm wondering, and I'd love your perspective, and we'll start with Fire about this. Have the changes and the cutbacks in media and how we think about media led to, in some way, the situation that Zane is talking about of an oversimplified, overly divided community that doesn't see nuance in the conversations that we're trying to have? So Farah, your thoughts?
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think the idea of news deserts is real. There are areas now in this country that don't have coverage, that don't have any news coverage at all. So that, first of all, is problematic. We know what an important facet of democracy media is. I mean, and Walter Cronkite said it is democracy. So that in itself is really important. We've also at the same time noticed, Nahid, maybe you're answering questions at your press conference, but here in Ontario, you're on a phone line trying to get information from a politician, and you're waiting on hold for several hours before you can even get an answer. And then you're not even really, it's not the same being in person to kind of hold people accountable and get that response. So I think that in itself it is a really different way of covering the news, right, than we're used to. So I think that is one way that I think things have changed. We're doing a lot more with a lot less. News is lean. And there isn't the money that there was in it before. So that's why you're not seeing in the third largest city. It's not just COVID, it's just how things have changed. And that's a real shift in how we've seen the media previously. Now in the States, of course, it's a different story because it is so polarized. I was there, and for the first time, Ali, you'll be interested in this, I spent, however many days, all I was doing, because I couldn't go out and do too many reports. I did a few, but I just sat there and I just flipped between Fox, between CNN, between Ali and MSNBC, and it felt like there was 2 different worlds. It felt like this was a country, but there was 2 countries in this one country. Right. And I think that's what's led to a lot of this. I think that the news also should bear some responsibility for the way things are right now.
It really is a chicken and an egg situation. Where did it start and where do we go from here? Ali, you've spoken a lot about this. I encourage people to seek out your 2017 TEDx talk. But give us a synopsis of your thoughts on the media and its role in this divided.
Well, I think there are 2 issues. One is, the tagline on the Washington Post says democracy dies in darkness. And what you described at Calgary City Council is it getting darker. The lights are getting, they're not as bright on you. And that's when things can start to go wrong. We have in the United States this problem in multiples. We have a lot of local, not just news deserts, we have places where people think they've got local news because there's still a local newspaper or a local newscast, but it's not from their city. It's not from their town. It's all aggregated information from these news conglomerates. So when I said that we had a 55% average turnout for presidential elections, that's presidential elections. If they're only state elections or House of Representative elections, the turnout is lower. If it's local elections, the turnout is yet lower. And yet that's where everything matters. So what we've done is we've it used to be that people would be in local government and then they would go to other parts of government, but they had the experience of dealing with people who needed their crime dealt with and their ambulances and their garbage and stuff like that. And you would have robust policy discussions around that, or education. Well, now we don't have robust policy discussions around policy issues. If you followed American media for the last 4 years, it is very high level stuff that doesn't necessarily affect individuals. And then suddenly you have something like George Floyd or the police brutality issues that we faced in the last 6 months. And that becomes very real to people. Then it's about policing and then it's about local stuff. But you realize, as we did with Ferguson, Missouri 6 years ago, that 2/3 of the population of Ferguson was African American, but there was only one member of the 5-member city council and only one African American police officer, because people don't pay attention to what's going on locally. And part of that is because we don't cover what's going on locally. So unless you're kind of nerdy and into local politics, you don't follow that stuff. And you're in the 3rd largest city in Canada. So imagine what happens in littler towns, which America is made of. So I think there are 2 issues. We don't have the commitment to news on that level. We don't have a commitment to policy discussions on that level. And then the things that Farah talks about, in that this is not the world's most lucrative thing for a lot of people to get into. So, it just becomes easier to sit at your desk. And so many journalists now are just desk jockeys, right? They've got a computer, they sit where they are, and they churn out stories, much of which is opinion or based on some phone calls. It is the dimming of the lights on democracy. And I think we have to take it very seriously.
Oh, I think it's absolutely clear that the erosion of local is turning people to more national and international tribes, right? So, when we see, and you and I have experienced this, right, in the political trenches, when we don't have local journalists covering the day-to-day beat, what ends up happening in many cases is that opinion starts driving narrative. Opinion pieces literally drove narratives, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with opinion pieces, but the fact is that when you don't have journalists kind of covering the day-to-day beat of what's going on, you can have certain narratives that start taking fold. Then you start compounding that when people don't have a local news node to access. They try to find their tribe somewhere else. They try to find it through social. They try to find it online. And they try to find that tribe that is not necessarily about seeking new information. It's about satiating the worldview that they already have. And this is where we get into the complicated, factors of social media, which in 2008 was really nice and rosy to kind of, put out your information, have conversations with. Well, let's be clear, in the 2020 environment, it's behavioral modification. And that's what we're ultimately finding, is that people start getting into narrower and narrower silos, which increase the fractures more and more that present themselves. So the ripple effects, or the butterfly effects of not having local, which then gets driven by narrative, which then tries to get you to find more of that particular narrative online and then find a tribe, is the path we've seen millions upon millions of people go down, which is potentially one of the hypotheses of the political fracturing we've seen on both sides of our collective borders.
So Farah, you've come from local. You are one of the most trusted faces of local news in your city in Toronto. Talk about that. Talk about local and telling the stories that matter to us on the ground in our communities.
Well, even to the extent when we're talking about, a fractured country, or we're talking about divisions, I mean, I've pushed the boundaries in some ways, talking about race, and bringing stories that aren't told on the local news. And it hasn't been easy, because there are a lot of people who, to me, I feel like I'm holding a mirror up to what's happening in society, but there are people who don't want to hear what the truth is, right? So that can be very difficult as well. So we're talking about COVID, for example, and how racialized communities are more impacted by COVID. Well, there's people who don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that, healthcare is different for somebody that doesn't look like you, or that, there's discrimination in hockey, for example. I remember I did a story on that, and the amount of hate mail I got after that was, I was not expecting that type of flood. So I think that, there still is this really polarized view where people people think that you're still in a way fake news, or you're still biased in your reporting, when really you're just showing people what's out there that maybe it wasn't shown before. So it's difficult. I mean, I'll get 3 messages in the day on the same story. One will say, you're a left wing hack, and one will say your right wing is showing, and one will call me fake news. So, and it's not just me. I mean, this happens to everybody. I can't even imagine what Ali goes through. So it's a very challenging time to do this job, especially when a certain someone has made a journalist, public enemy number one.
I want to come back to the issue of fake news, and I don't really mean fake news, but I mean the branding of fake news. But I don't want to leave this issue of racism. As people of color who've aspired to the top of your positions, who are there on our televisions, I think you have a unique perspective on this. But in the midst of the George Floyd stuff in the summer, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, I had 2 fascinating conversations. They were each over an hour and a half long, with the publisher of the local newspaper and with the managing editor of one of the local news stations. And the conversations were about casual racism, or institutional racism, if you prefer, in how we tell our stories. So for Remembrance Day, for example, on the CBC, there was a story about a US war veteran who was doing a nice thing, cycling to all the war monuments in Calgary on Remembrance Day. And in the very first line, they said, "A proud Sikh and a soldier." And I thought to myself, well, his name is Singh and he wears a turban. People can probably connect the dots. What does his being a Sikh have to do with it? And it was just one example of the kinds of deconstructionist narratives, if I can sound all academic for a moment, that we have to think about in terms of how we tell stories. And Farah, you've really been a trailblazer in this, in so many ways, helping people see, especially in a city as diverse as Toronto, their country in a new way. But what does that work like institutionally? Does the media understand that we've been telling stories of the powerful and we need to get off of the sort of the National Geographic 1950s special when we tell stories of people who don't look the same?
Look, I will be honest, I think it took for all of this to happen, this racial reckoning to take place, for things to change. I mean, I politely laughed at comments made 5 years ago that I would never laugh at now, that I would call people out, that I would have the courage to call people out on now. And I think that says a lot. But we have to remember that though you're watching television and you're seeing bylines that have names that are, ethnic, that you're comfortable with, most of the people that are still running everything don't come from there. It's going to take time, though. I think things are changing. I'm very optimistic about the future. I mean, even when we started out, like, Ali was the only one I could go to ask advice. There was nobody who looked like me on camera. And I remember he was working on a business show, a business channel then, and it wasn't even, I didn't want to do business. So, but it was the only one. And now, when we look at the amount of Ismailis that are out there, that are, it gives me goosebumps just talking about it. So I think that we are moving in the right direction. I think things are changing, but certainly discrimination has existed in our industry. I'm sure many places it certainly does, but it took for this to make change, and there will be change.
Oh, I want to go so deep on this question. I want to talk about accents, and I want to talk about the voices that we value and that we don't value. But I will, at this point, disclose a secret, which is that Farah mentioned all of the Ismailis who are working in media now, and there are a lot of them now. So on the night of the Canadian election, Zayn, of course, being Zayn, started a little text group of all of the Ismailis who were on TV that night. Of course, it's called the Farah Nasser Fan Club, just saying. But tonight, Ali, as you answer the question about racism within the media, I'm also putting you on the spot.
I would love that.
Will you join the Farah Nasser Fan Club?
So every time I talk to Farah or see her or exchange a message with her, I'm glad to hear that story, because I remember it when I was starting out, and it was yet harder. But I think representation is the answer on all of these fronts, because we're talking about racism now, but casual homophobia, casual making jokes about people's weight. The Me Too movement indicated to people that, oh, you know, these jokes you've been making or those comments you've been passing on how someone's dressed, also not appropriate. So we all just have to have this open mind and say, there's so much out there we don't know. And we don't know because we didn't invite the people to the table to have the conversation. So now in newsrooms, if you have the representation, you just learn things you didn't know before. You learn what you don't say and what's inappropriate to people. I remember saying something about transgenders, I think I said on TV, and I got all these things. They don't call people transgenders, you call them transgendered people or transgender people. It's like, okay, great. Now I know it. Now I will do it right. But the things that I have said in my past that I didn't know were even wrong because there was no one there to tell me that it was wrong, now that all changes. And the decision you have to make now as journalists, as the consuming public, is what side of that do you want to be on? Do you want to sit there and say, that's interesting. I didn't know how that worked. Thanks for telling me. Or let's discuss it. Or do you want to say, don't change my worldview, don't change my reality because that's not how I learned it, so it can't be true.
So Zane, how do we get those stories into the media so the media feels more authentic to all of us?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it starts, Nahed, with this conversation that, and I think Ali and Far are excellent examples of this, that people that look like us aren't just there to cover stories about people who just look like us. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that I've kind of seen is just an assumption. When our prime minister during the last federal election had a scandal, the blackface, brownface scandal that was going on, I had 24 media appearances over the next 2 days, and I wasn't the only racialized or brown or black person that had those appearances. If you just walked by the hallway at the CBC or at the CTV and you just looked up, there's probably a black or brown person commenting on what happened. And then guess what happened, Nahed? 2 days later, the story went away, and all those people who provided excellent commentary just because they had a brown or black face were nowhere to be seen. They were excellent at providing commentary on so many things. They were educated professors. They had lived experience. They had, so much texture and depth. But guess what? They were only brought in to comment because guess what? The face of that guy matched the face of you. And I think, there is a real sort of opportunity here to do that. Per Farah's point of saying, how do we get more and more people, not just at the table, but controlling the decisions of the agenda that gets put on that table.
Thank you so much for that. I want to make sure that we get into another conversation here. And that really is that when you think back and you think of Walter Cronkite, as Farah has alluded to, or Lloyd Robertson, or Peter Mansbridge, notice these are all white men I'm talking about, but my point is that these were, Barbara Walters, we'll throw a white woman in there. These are trusted voices, right? These are the voices that people turned to when they needed to know the truth. And now we live in a world where, frankly, I am scared for Farah and Ali when they're out on the street covering something because I don't know what people are going to say. They're going to talk about the fake news. First of all, I'd like a personal perspective on how does that make you feel as a journalist, as someone who's engaged in this work, whose passion is to tell these stories. But second of all, how did we get here? And how do we restore trust in our institutions, but particularly in the media? Because I, for one, believe you can't have a healthy democracy without trust and faith in media. So Farah, I'll go to you first.
I wrote a lot of notes on this because I think we all have a role to play here. So for government, I think it's supporting media. So as we've seen, we talked about this news deserts concept, the idea that, some of these media organizations, they need some help in certain areas. As you mentioned, it's a part of a healthy democracy. It benefits all of us. So that's a big thing. Citizens, get perspective. Learn from other people. Watch perspectives that are not your own. I spend most of my time in the United States actually watching Fox News to try to understand how people feel, a perspective that we don't normally get in Canada. And also, we need to educate our kids. Media literacy is so important. We need to teach our kids what fake news is, what misinformation is. And as journalists, we need to do a better idea. And this is for the next generation, but also for our viewers, to really teach them what the difference is between a pundit, between a journalist, between a commentator, because these are key differences. When you're watching the news and you're watching CNN late at night or you're watching it during the day, it's very different. And I think people don't really understand that. I think that's been lost on a lot of people. Just like when you're flipping the newspaper and you see the editorial. I don't know if the general public, and especially our youngsters, if they really understand what the difference is. And I think it is so important to point that out. And I think it's also news organizations, we have to go back to our core values. I mean, our core values, this idea of, transparency, integrity, these best practices that we grew up with. Because I think in some cases we've gone away from that. And so I think there's really, again, a role to play for everybody. And there's a lot of work to do.
Ali, I've read everywhere that you do fake news. Tell me about fake news.
Well, it became a real problem because in May, I was in Minneapolis covering the George Floyd protests, and at one point I got gassed a few times. I actually travel now with a kit that has a bulletproof vest, a mask, and a helmet, which I've never used in the United States before. I used to use that when I traveled overseas. I now have that for the United States. We got gassed a few times, and then at one point the police broke into a crowd that was marching. It was a completely peaceful march. I had been covering it for a few hours, and they gassed everybody, and we had masks, so most of the people left, and we were now at the front of the line, and I got shot by a rubber bullet. Now, I don't know what happened that night. I'm not really clear on it, and one day we'll have time to have a proper investigation. We were very clearly media, and we got shot. Then we retreated, and we came to another intersection where there were no people anymore because all the civilians had left because they were gassing everybody. So we were walking now, trying to get out. And we actually put our hands up and said, we're media. And the police said, we don't care, and they fired again. Nobody got hit that time because they're just bad shots. So, Farah's talking about government support. I'd take not government antagonism at this point. It's unsafe. Now, I've done nothing but travel for the last 3 or 4 months. And we have to travel with security. We get threats. This is, as Farah said, when she met me, I was a business reporter, man. I did the stock market. What's with the threats? Nobody signed up for this stuff. We tell our stories, but when people say, and there's lots of valid criticism of why we are not trusted by people and why people don't see their stories reflected. But when you go down that line and you suggest that our job is to bear witness, to tell you things are happening, and then to hold power to account. And when the government interferes in your ability to do that, and when leaders start doing that, that's when it starts to break down, because there are a whole lot of people looking for answers and looking for people to blame. And when you make that the media, and I don't care whether it's my media or somebody else's media, there were a number of reporters from other outlets, most of whom report on me critically, who were arrested during protests. And I was out there, trying to defend their First Amendment rights. You don't shut the media down. You argue in the arena of discussion, of ideas, right? Like you do, Nahid. That's what we should be doing. If there's an argument to be had about why we are covering things the way they are, we should have that discussion openly. But things have taken a dark turn, and it is worrisome, because there are a lot of my colleagues I know who say, I didn't sign up for this, and I'm not looking for this.
Thank you for sharing that story, Ali. It's a shocking one, and I'm happy that you were willing and courageous enough to tell us about that one thing that happened to you that is emblematic of so many other things.
It happened to a lot of my colleagues, too. There were in that week alone, there were 300 instances of police violence against reporters. So I got off easy.
Well, you got shot. I don't know that that's that easy. But, I think that, Zain, I want you to touch on one thing, because then I want to go to a little news you can use in terms of what we need to do to strengthen our media and our democratic institutions. But Zain, I'm going to ask you a very basic question, which is, what's the role of media in strengthening our institutions, and particularly in strengthening our democracy?
Yeah, and I think it's vital. It is one of the recipes in this cocktail of civil society, right? This ability to have a press that is free, that's able to voice the truth, that it does not have to be beholden to what I call the two sidesisms, right? One of the biggest things we have seen that at least in my observations of the last 4 years, is pushing the press to do two sides, right? It's not about covering both sides. It's having and giving the press the runway and the freedom to say, no, this is what's happening, right? The old adage, what was it? If it's raining outside, it's not about asking some person to say, is it raining or is it not raining? It's about going out and saying, is it raining or not yourself? And I think right now, certain political groups, certain advocacy groups, frankly, social media has pushed this two-sidesism into media outlets and journalistic organizations. And I think what we need, and this is not really a fault of their own, is to give these institutions a runway to say, go report the facts. As long as it's true, the wind and the people and the safeguards and the rail guards we've built into our system are behind you to do that. So I think that's the main source, because, to Ali's point, and which is also like that Washington Post tagline that democracy dies in darkness, really, if we have a press that is just there to report on both sides and let you make up your mind, so to speak, as has been the MO for various news organizations, then outright we are failing the civil society and the healthy discourse and the outright reporting of facts that we need to sustain a strong and robust civil society.
The problem is, I feel like this other side is, I get that you can't report when there's horrible things happening. You can't report two sides. There aren't two sides. There's right and wrong in a way, right? There's one side when we're talking about race, inequality. But when I'm watching, correspondents or people like almost ridiculing the other side, I don't know what purpose that serves. I think if it's based on facts and evidence, that's one thing. But we are so divided right now. There needs to be a way to tell the stories that bring people together. Those beautiful moments where you hear that, somebody who's, a gun advocate is hugging somebody who's from Black Lives Matter. There has to be ways to tell those stories and bring people together. Because again, when I was watching cable news, it was making fun of that other side. When Hillary Clinton called a bunch of blue collar workers deplorables and then lost the election, there was a reason. You alienate people, and that's not what we need right now.
Ali, you've got a very unique perspective on this, given the variety of different media outlets you've worked in, and you find yourself now, of course, at MSNBC, which has a particular point of view, shall we say, or worldview. How do we reconcile these things? How do we reconcile the need to be fair and just in our reporting and our storytelling with the need to really call out bad things when they happen?
So I think there's a bit of each of Farah and Zain's views on this that I think have to combine to make sense. To Zain's point, we need freedom to tell the stories as they are, and that comes from resources. The only way you bear witness is if you can actually fly someone to the border and look at those cages and tell you what's actually going on and interview people and follow their stories and do all that kind of stuff. And if you're just doing stuff from your desk and your computer, that's not going to get told. On the other side, Farah makes the point that, do we signpost for people what's commentary and what's opinion and what's news coverage? And I think we, and Naid, from my fake news speech, my TEDx talk, that I feel that we've failed people for decades on that front. We don't signpost it, so people don't hear it. So I've spent the last 2-3 months out on the street talking to people, and I ask them, I go to different cities across America to ask people about their own personal experiences. What do I get? Bumper sticker, political stuff. I'm hearing from somebody on the streets of Kenosha, not about what happened in Kenosha last week that upset them, but I'm hearing something that Donald Trump said about it. I'm at the border wall in Arizona talking to locals, and I'm hearing politicized polemic. And that's what the problem is, that the combination of not having local news, the idea that people don't form their own opinions on what happens around them, but they fall into these support groups on social media and in cable news, all contributes to the idea that if I take the runway that Zain says I deserve, which I will take every night, I take it, and I lose half the viewers who don't want to share that, who want their warm milk. They will go somewhere else, and they do go somewhere else. And I struggle with that. I wonder about that a lot. I'm 30 years into this career, and I wonder how we fix it, and I worry about what I've done to spoil it.
Folks, I'm going to reveal a Friday Night Reflections production secret right now, which is we are filming this in a tight window of time when Farah has just come off the air, and when Ali is about to go on the air. So we don't have a ton of time, though. I think this could go on all night. This is amazing. My heart is racing with the intellectual things that are happening in this panel right now. But let's end on some news you can use, if you like, which is I'm going to ask each of you in turn, starting with Farah, what do we as citizens do? How can we as citizens build our communities and our democracy? And how can the media play a role in that? But what can we do to support that kind of media that is community building? We'll start with Farah.
I think with citizenry, it comes down to listening to the other perspective. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's not what you're going to want to hear. You're going to want to yell at the TV, but you need to know that this is how people feel. Why do they feel isolated? Why do they not want to wear masks because of COVID? Maybe they're worried about their business. Maybe they don't want to think it exists because they're losing money and they're bankrupt. Like there's always other reasons why people feel the way that they do. And I think it's important for all of us to really have empathy and understand. We are not going to agree with it, but it's important to understand where things come from. So that's one area. And I think, I'm a mom, I have 2 little kids. I think it is so crucial that we really educate this next generation. I'm very passionate about this idea of media literacy and explaining to them how things work. And as you're watching, point that out. Point that out to your teenage kids about who this person's giving their opinion. This is facts. What the difference is between those two. I've already started teaching my 7-year-old about the difference between fact and opinion. So I think those are 2 things we can do. And then as media organizations, again, we need to go back to these core values. The Nation Media Group, which we all know is very close to our hearts. One of their core values is news should not appease, augment, or respond to political commercial interests, and journalists should really test that so what factor. Why is this story important? Why does it matter to me? Why am I telling it? So what? And I think as journalists and as media organizations, we need to do better at that.
I'd start with sitting down with your family, perhaps even your friends, and auditing the media diet that you have. At the end of the day, you are the media that you consume. And so I think it'd be a fascinating exploration as an extension to Farah's point, sitting down with your family and saying, what are we each consuming? You will be surprised where some of the folks in your family, where even your partner or your significant other might be getting their news from. It might be certain Twitter accounts you've never heard of, certain media outlets you have maybe not considered. So audit that and then try to, figure out verified sources. And then the second thing I'd say is around social media. We've discussed it a bit, but social media has really become a rage machine for many folks. Is it still a great distribution mechanism for news? Absolutely. But what we have to realize is that if you're not paying for it, you are the product. And what these platforms have figured out is that by putting anger and rage into the zeitgeist, into micro cuts of fake news, that which, by the way, is not easy to discern. That's one of the things we should talk about, is that fake news online is really, really hard to discern. But go with verified sources and understand that everything on social media that you see, especially with products that you're not paying for, you are being commoditized on, and to recognize that.
Ali Velshi, last word to you, but as I ask you that, I know that the audience will abandon us and go for their warm milk if I don't ask you from your vantage point, what's going to happen in the United States? How are we going to get out of this crazy situation we're in? So talk to us about what citizens can do and give us your opinion on that.
December 13th, the Electoral College is going to vote for the next president of the United States. And with some luck, all of this stuff that's going on right now will be over by then. So I'm very worried about what this portends for American democracy. But to the point about news you can use, think about your cell phone, right? The way the cell phone figures out where you are and which tower to use is it's always got to have 3 towers. It triangulates where you are. If you have 3 points in space, you always know where you are. So triangulate your information the same way. When you see something, make sure you can find it somewhere else. So the guy who went to that suburban DC pizza parlor because he thought that Hillary Clinton was running a pedophilia ring in it, he went with a gun. And he actually thought he was going to save little children. He thought he was doing something good because he had bad information. Now, just make sure before and that's an extreme example because generally people don't respond to the news by taking a gun and going to do something, but we all respond to the news somehow in our conversations or in our voting. So try and find the information somewhere else, even if it's from a different perspective. If you at least understand that 2 different people are reporting on this from 2 different organizations, from 2 different perspectives, at least the underlying story might be true. I don't know that social media is compatible with democracy. I really worry about whether in the end it has really removed us from reality. I remember when the internet started, because I was just starting as a reporter at the time, and when it became popularized and cell phones were started and we would get browsers on our computers at work, I remember thinking, no one will ever be able to lie again. This is the best thing that ever happened. Social media came out. If you tell a lie, they're all going to call you out for it, and that's it. I had no idea. I was so naive. I had no idea that you'd be able to lie better and louder and faster and more effectively than you ever could before. So I think we all have to, we can't fix society. We can fix our own consumption habits. Just like your cell phone, triangulate your information and at least know that what you're consuming is true, then formulate an opinion on it.
Thanks so much, Ali. I said that would be the last word, but man, that was amazing. So I do want to give Farah and Zain one last chance for any final words. First to you, Zain.
No, I'm good. Thank you for this excellent conversation. You know, I think we find a very interesting space we're in right now, and I think, you know, it's with the leadership of folks like Farah and Ali who are not just pushing the stories that matter, but pushing the editorial decisions that matter to get us the stories, to unearth those stories that makes our democracy and civil society richer. So thank you for the incredible conversation.
I just want to kind of go over the point about social media, because I think that's where a lot of people get their news. And I think what Zain said is so correct. I mean, if you're not paying for news, you're the product. And, you know, we're in this place where we just need like this, you know, as Ram calls it, Nescafe journalism, right? We just need this hit. We just need to know what's going on, but really dig deeper. And if anybody watching is part of a social media company, take some responsibility. I mean, figure out these algorithms to kind of widen the perspective, because again, these are echo chambers. You are following people from Jamaat Ghana, people that are your friends, and you're getting one perspective. It's not the perspective of everybody. And keep that in mind as you're reading this. Have that knowledge as you're going through social media.
Thank you so much. You know, people often think that politicians and the media are at odds. And certainly we've seen a lot of that with politicians of all stripes recently. But I want to say something that I don't often get to say as a politician, which is I want to say to you all, thank you. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for shining a light in a very dark and cold world sometimes, and for continuing to tell the stories that connect people to their communities, because ultimately that is what builds us together as a community. So Farah Nasser, Ali Velshi, Zain Velji, thank you so much for spending your time today. Thank you for giving people who thought they were going to have a nice quiet reflection with their chai and nankatai a huge amount of things to think about, and thank you for the work you do every single day.
چی فوق‌العاده؟ این خیلی عالی بود. مغز و قلبم می‌تپد. چی پنال فوق‌العاده‌ای. و دوباره از اعضای جلسه که به ما برای این گفتگوی با شکوه پیوستند متشکرم. آیا توجه داشتید که علی ولشی هرگز به سوال مستقیم من درباره کانون هواداران فرا ناصر پاسخ نداد؟ امیدوارم امشب فرصت برای دیدن پیشنمایش داشته باشید. من میدانم که همه ما وقتی میبینیم روزنامه‌نگاران اسماعیلی اخبار را پوشش میدهند احساس غرور میکنیم و از اعضای جماعت که در روزنامه‌نگاری کار میکنند در اینجا یک تیم بسیار خوبی داریم و من میدانم که ما به تک تک آنها و کاری که آنها به نمایندگی جامعه و بیان داستانهای ما را دارند افتخار میکنیم. بنابراین مثل همیشه بازتاب جمعه شبها بدون بیان موسیقی عالی نخواهد بود و ما همین حالا می خواهیم برای بالا بردن آب و هوایتان به آن سمت برویم و فقط از شما می خواهیم مراقب صحت و سلامتی خود و فامیل و جامعه خود باشید. با دستهای پاک و قلبهای باز و جمعه آینده در بازتاب جمعه شبها شما را می بینیم. علب خاشن، خدا حافظ.
Ali Mola, Ali Mola, Ali, Ali, Mola, Ali, Ali Mola. मैं विरद करूं दम अली अली, हर सांस करूं बस अली अली, तू ही मुर्शिद मेरा अली अली, बस अली 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 अली। मैं विरद करूं दम अली अली, हर सांस करूं बस अली अली, तू ही मुर्शिद मेरा अली अली, बस अली 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 अली। मोमिनों के अमीर है अली अली, वलियों के वली है अली अली, सखियों के सखी है अली अली, बस अली 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 अली। मैं विरद करूं दम अली अली, हर सांस करूं बस अली अली, तू ही मुर्शिद मेरा अली अली, बस अली 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 अली। मैं विरद करूं दम अली अली, हर सांस करूं बस अली अली तू ही मुर्शिद मेरा अली अली बस अली 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 हो मस्ती में मैं तो तेरी झूमता रहूं गली गली अब तो मैं घूमता रहूं इश्क की मंजिल चढ़ता रहूं मैं विरद करूं दम अली अली हर सांस करूं बस अली अली तू ही मुर्शिद मेरा अली अली बस अली 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 मैं विरद करूं दम अली अली हर सांस करूं बस अली अली तू ही मुर्शिद मेरा अली अली बस अली 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 मुश्किल कुशा है अली अली शेरे खुदा है अली अली लाफता इल्ला है अली अली बस अली 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 मैं विरद करूं दम अली अली हर सांस करूं बस अली अली तू ही मुर्शिद मेरा अली अली बस अली 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 मैं विरद करूं दम अली अली हर सांस करूं बस अली अली तू ही मुर्शिद मेरा अली अली बस अली 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 मौला 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 अली 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 शाहे मर्दा तू ही शेरे यज़दा तू ही क़ुव्वते परवरदिगार दीन का वली बस तू ही नबी का वज़ी बस तू ही है मेरे आका मौलाए कायनात मैं विरद करूं दम अली अली हर सांस करूं बस अली अली तू ही मुर्शिद मेरा अली अली बस अली 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 मैं विरद करूं दम अली अली हर सांस करूं बस अली अली तू ही मुर्शिद मेरा अली अली बस अली 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 मोमिनों के अमीर हैं अली अली वलियों के वली हैं अली अली सखियों के सखी हैं अली अली बस अली 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 मैं विरद करूं दम अली अली हर सांस करूं बस अली अली तू ही मुर्शिद मेरा अली अली बस अली 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 मैं विरद करूं दम अली अली हर सांस करूं बस अली अली तू ही मुर्शिद मेरा अली अली बस अली अली